Hi, it's Mo Bunnell. I'm your host here at Real Relationships, Real Revenue. I and my teams have trained over 15,000 experts all over the world on sound, efficient, and authentic business development techniques. And I'm joined today by Karim Nehdi. Karim's CEO of Herrmann International. They own the thinking style assessment called the Herrmann Brain Dominance instrument, and I think it's fantastic. In this interview, Karim and I go back and forth on how you can use cognitive diversity to grow your book of business, grow your relationships, and grow your career. So, before we get into it, know that if you want our best tips on how you can do those same three things, growing your book of business, your relationships, and your career, head over to growbigplaybook.com. That's growbigplaybook.com. You'll get an instant download, and I write a personal little short email every single week, little article on what you can do to have more success with your client relationship outreach and with your broader business development techniques. So growbigplaybook.com is where you get that. So without further ado, here is Karim Nehdi. Hey everybody, it's Mo. You already know that I'm with Karim Nehdi, and I'm really excited to have him on the show because we've collaborated for years. So Karim, let's get right into it since people already know you. What's your big idea on how people can grow their book of business, grow their relationships, and grow their career?
Well, ultimately, I think the big idea that we have, and something you know very well, Mo, is this notion of cognitive diversity, harnessing cognitive diversity, which is really another way of saying the differences in the way that we think to build more effective relationships, to build a more effective career, and to ultimately grow your book of business. Can really help there.
Yeah, we'll go deeper.
I mean, it sounds pretty obvious when you say it out loud, right? Different people think differently, right? But it's something that actually, in the day-to-day sort of work environment, probably doesn't get the credence that it's due. And what we've seen is that the most effective leaders and the most effective business developers as well are able to harness those differences in thought, that cognitive diversity, for maximum effect. Because the reality is every organization, every team has diversity of thought. I mean, every individual even has diversity of thought, right? We all have different sort of neural pathways that shift over time and that create kind of different thought processes in our minds. But again, those kind of teams, those organizations, most people don't know how to manage that cognitive diversity in a way to sort of overcome some of the perils, some of the the cognitive biases that we all face and struggle with sometimes, the perils of groupthink or conflict, right? We innately sort of default and seek out people who think like us because that's kind of the neural path of least resistance, right? So the best organizations, the best teams, the best leaders know how to sort of break out of that familiarity bias and really tap in to the differences that exist, those really powerful differences that exist in the way that we think.
Yeah, so let's add some value to our audience because, gosh, I'm such a fan of everybody knows you're CEO of the Herrmann International, and you own the intellectual property around the Herrmann Brain Dominance instrument, HBDI. And you obviously, I'm a big fan of it because we use it in all our courses and things like that. And we've been partners for a long time. And I absolutely love working with you and the team at Herrmann. So let's actually go deeper. So why don't you give our audience your version, how you describe it? I think this will be interesting because I know how I describe it and our teams describe it. But describe the HBDI, describe the four major ways of thinking cognitively, and then I guess if you do that, then we can go a little bit deeper around, developing books of business and deepening relationships and growing careers and things like that.
Well, I mean, the brain is an amazingly intricate, complicated organ, right? Billions of interconnected neurons, and realistically, we are only still scratching the surface of understanding its true potential. But one of the things that we've really learned over the past couple of decades is that there are these sort of cognitive modes, these systems, right, that are ingrained paths that help dictate the way that we think, right? And you can think of, those as a couple of different spectrums in terms of, more intuitive and divergent thoughts versus more kind of rational and convergent thought. Another spectrum between sort of more cerebral or intellectual type of thinking versus more instinctive gut feel sort of thinking, right? And so those spectrums ultimately come together again because the brain is whole and interconnected. you can kind of look at the combinations of those different modes of thinking in terms of a number of different systems that ultimately really bear out a lot of the differences between how one person thinks and another person thinks. And so those four key systems that we measure, the four sort of scales of the whole brain model and the HBDI that you mentioned, are first analytical thought. So this is the kind of mathematical, quantitative, logical type of thinking. Then there's structural thought, which is also known as temporosequential thought in some of the cognitive science circles. That's more process and detail oriented. There's relational thought, the third one, which we call the C quadrant. It's characterized by the red color, which is more interpersonal, social, emotional. And then last but not least, certainly I think given our shared preferences there, Mo, there's experimental thought, sort of that holistic, synthesizing, big picture view. And the reality is that we all have all four of those different ways of thinking within our brains. We all have those pathways, right? And everyone has access to each of them. But over time, through both nature and nurture, we develop these sort of preferences, these cognitive preferences that become our sort of default way of thinking. And we stick to those pretty tightly. We often find it a struggle to kind of stretch beyond those, and that's where a lot of the trouble can come in. Is that sometimes if we only think about things in one way, we lose a lot of the opportunity, and that's true as much in business development as anywhere else.
It sure is, and we've had, I don't know, 15 or 20,000 or whatever people take the HBDI as part of our program. So I've just seen it over and over again. How eye-opening this is to people. I think we all recognize when we just click with somebody or when we don't click with somebody, but people don't necessarily have this really simple framework. So those four ways of thinking: analytical, structure, relational, experimental, like you laid out. When you meet somebody and they're sort of think the same way you do, you just click. And Karim, I'll tell a funny story that you may remember. When we met the first time, you met in our office in Midtown Atlanta. You came in, you had like a purple sport coat on. Do you remember this? It was like a velour like sport coat. It was very experimental, just even the way you're dressed. And you walked in, I'm like, and you gave me this huge hug we had never met before. Very relational, right? And I just I immediately thought, I like this guy. This is going to be fun. Like, I was probably running 1,000 directions. We were going to meet because you were coming into town or whatever. And in just a few seconds, my gut feel was, or my intuition was like, I'm going to like this guy. And it turned out to be true. I did like this guy. I do like you. So
thank you, Mo. Thank you. The feeling is mutual, obviously. And just a quick explanation on the purple sport coat. Because colors have so much meaning in our business, I kind of have to choose colors that are neutral, right? It can't be blue or yellow or red or green. I got to go with the pinks and the purples, and unfortunately for everyone involved, the oranges, because those don't have some sort of meaning. I'm not wearing my thinking on my sleeve.
That is really funny. I didn't know that. So I just thought you were bold, man. I just thought you had big ideas.
Well, that's true. You can keep thinking that, though. No problem.
But it's true. You do. This is so funny. Yeah. And so for everybody listening or watching, the HBDI has color coding to make it super easy to remember and letter coding to remember. So analytical is blue or quadrant A, structure is green or quadrant B, relational is red or quadrant C, experimental is yellow or quadrant D. So that's where the colors come in. So do this for me. Let's go deeper, Karim. I want to go a smidge deeper in this episode before we sort of wrap things up and go to our next one. But tell me about your view. I want to hear your personal view on this. Why do we really connect when people naturally think in our quadrants? And when are things not connective? Like where are the potential downfalls in the model? Or not downfalls, but where the trouble spots between, say, pairs of quadrants? So give me your 2 cents on those two.
Yeah, well, I mean, we connect, or sometimes think we connect, right? On areas of preference, of alignment. It's sort of a natural. Again, it's kind of that path of least resistance to some degree for our brains. Our brains are always trying to save energy, right? And so they're looking for those heuristics. And when you see that match in somebody, right, it increases the comfort level. You start to your ideas start flowing, and you start to connect on that side. But as you say, when there's mismatch, or when there's maybe an incorrect assumption, then that can lead to some significant rub. That can lead to some friction. So, we see that a lot in terms of these sort of diametrically opposed quadrants in our model. Those analytical thinkers who can be very, very focused on the facts, on the data, on what can sort of objectively be seen in the world, can often feel a strong conflict with those more relational thinkers who are, sensing and really picking up on cues that may not be quite as tangible, but ultimately play an important role in a lot of aspects of communication and interaction, right? And so, a way of thinking about this in organizational terms is, you kind of have IT on one side, right, who are often more of those analytical and in some cases structured thinkers. And on the other side, you have, let's say, client-facing team members, right? And there's often this sort of tension between what IT wants and privacy and security concerns and all of those things, right? And on the other side, what's best for the client and what's ultimately going to make people happiest, right? And so you have that kind of rub, that conflict between the two. And you have the same thing between the sort of experimental mindset and that's more structural safekeeping mindset, right? The experimental mindset wants to try new things. They want to wear purple velour jackets. They want to, kind of go and seek novelty and difference. And they're always kind of scanning for, sort of things that are divergent from the norm, from the existing patterns. And on the other side, that structural thinker is, really appreciating the norms and what has worked in the past, and the safekeeping, the lack of risk in going with the tried and true, right? And so again, those can kind of create a bit of tension in an organizational setting and certainly in a relationship setting. And so, as you think about this in the context of business development, knowing those differences obviously can be hugely powerful, right? If you know that someone's going to be coming at this with a very risk-averse mindset, then you probably want to, tamper down the crazy idea discussion, spend a little bit less time on that in the agenda, and spend a lot more time on really helping them understand the plan, the process, how it's going to all work.
Man, I love it.
And ultimately, go ahead.
Well, and I was going to say, and then you can follow up, is being able to read these clues is really powerful. And listeners and viewers, we're going to cover that in another episode, just one or two away. So be sure you watch the next ones because I want to get Karim's personal viewpoint on this stuff. But one thing I was just going to say to wrap it up is what's really cool about that tension you're talking about is if we don't harness it, it can rip people apart. Our clients, internal colleagues, things like that. But if we do harness it, that tension leads to better results when you can see both sides. So give me your thoughts on that, and then we'll wrap things up.
Well, that's it, right? That's the whole notion of cognitive diversity and being able to tap into that, right? We've long worked with BlackRock, which is one of the world's largest asset managers, and the co-founder, chairman, and CEO, Larry Fink, is known as kind of being one of the most influential voices in business, right? In part because BlackRock owns the largest share of probably all publicly traded companies. But, Larry says the most important component of good management, good leadership, and good stewardship is making sure that you have diversity of mind. And that's really born out of his own experience. I mean, he comes from a, long-term finance background. You'd think kind of analytical, that sort of blue finance sort of mindset, but he actually comes at it from a very different perspective, a very relational perspective, and is actually, has had an amazing career in bringing that unique viewpoint to organization, to a industry that's otherwise dominated by another way of thinking, right? And his ability to not just bring that unique viewpoint himself, but really harness that within his organization, I know he feels is a big part of the success of BlackRock. And, in my experience, people like Larry, who have the biggest impact, are really able to tap into those perspectives and effectively see things that others can't, right? They're able to pull in those kind of viewpoints to see around corners, and that takes some practice. As you know from the statistics in our kind of millions of profiles, about 3% of us have an equal balance of thinking across the different systems that we measure, and the rest of us just need to get comfortable with stretching beyond our default sort of modes, heuristics, and biases, because you got to be agile when the situation requires it. It's like Charles Schultz said, life is like a 10-speed bicycle. We all have gears that we don't use, right? And those kind of thinking patterns get more ingrained over time, like a well-trodden path in this forest. And Of course, you can take another course through the trees. There may be a little bit of undergrowth or sort of a few bushes that you need to clear out of the way, but ultimately we can all do that. It just takes that stretching to tap into the brain's kind of natural neuroplasticity, and building their comfort with sort of flexing those different cognitive muscles.
Karim, that was a perfect wrap to this episode. So people are going to want more of you. They're going to want more of Herrmann International. Where should they go?
So, well, I mean, as we've mentioned, Mo is a deep valued partner. We've worked together for many years and has access to all these great tools. So my first stop in my journey would be to talk to Mo, especially if you're looking to up your business development game. But then if you're kind of interested in this broader notion of cognitive diversity, we've also set up a little landing page where you can get access to some free resources that I've mentioned and we'll talk about in subsequent episodes. That's thinkherrmann.com/Mo. Herrmann spelled 2 R's, 2 N's, HERRMANN/Mo, M-O, no need for the E.
That's right, the E. There's no need for the E, people. If you know a Mo without an E, talk to him. You don't need the E. It's sitting out there doing nothing. It's silent. All right, so I love that. And folks, if you want our perspective on this BD stuff, then you can just go to growbigplaybook.com, and sign up for our weekly newsletter. We have an instant download that'll give you the mindsets you need to be successful at business development. So we're going to dig into more things, folks, and we're going to go deeper in a future episode because there's a couple coming out right after this one. Karim's going to actually help us decode when we're working with external clients and consultants and people that we work with or whatever. And then internally, how do we decode how other people think? How can we flex? How can we bring in that plasticity that he talked about? So I can't wait about it. Or wait for it. So tune in for that. So Karim, thanks for being on the show. And
My pleasure, Mo. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this has been awesome. All right, thanks everybody. Hey everybody, welcome back to our next episode where I'm interviewing Karim Nehdi. Karim is CEO of Herrmann International, one of our most trusted partners, incredible rainmaker himself, incredible strategist and leader, and I'm just so thrilled to have him on the show. If you didn't catch it, check out the last episode because it talks about some frameworks, the Herrmann Brain Dominance instrument specifically, that we're going to use in this one. So you can watch or listen to this episode as a standalone, but you might get a lot more out of it if you think of this one and the couple around it as an entire sequence of really powerful tools that we're giving you. So Karim, big question for you on this episode is, how can we use our cognitive diversity to create and close more deals?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, it comes down to, well, let me ask you this question, Mo. What if you could read the minds of your customers?
Ooh, I like it.
What if you could just get a special view, into exactly how they're thinking about that proposal, that pitch that you just gave them? What if you could, in fact, predict how they're going to respond to it in advance, and get that degree of visibility? I mean, ultimately, we know that cognitive diversity exists. We know that people think differently in different situations, and we can spot clues to help understand what might be the thinking or the mindset of someone that we're trying to develop a relationship with in advance to do a better job with that, to do it with empathy, to do it with influence.
Well, I love it, and I have a feeling I know where you're going to go. But so let's help our viewers, our audience, our listeners think about how do they do that. So I know it can be done. You know it can be done because we both teach this stuff all the time. So walk us through a scenario. Walk us through a scenario of somebody. How do they do what you just said? Because it's very doable.
The first step is just in understanding where your own preferences lie. In the last episode, we talked a little bit about the different systems that we use to think. Again, each of us has access to each one of these systems. We use this whole brain model to define these 4 interconnected cognitive systems of analytical thought, structural thought, relational thought, and experimental thought. And so the first step is just, knowing where you sit, understanding yourself so you know how you show up in a relationship, right? And so, the first question I would ask anybody is, of those terms, things like analytical, structural, relational, experimental, or, some of the other descriptors like mathematical or quantitative or logical for that analytical thinker, process or detail-oriented, very decisive in that structural thought area, relational being interpersonal or social or emotional, experimental being holistic, synthesizing, big picture. Which of those best describe you? I mean, Mo, which of those best describe you?
Yeah, so experimental is my number one with a real strong analytical. And I got to tell you, I haven't shared this very often, but when I got my first results, I actually the person giving me the debrief had me predict what my results would be. And for those quick sidebar for everybody, there's a whole 120 question assessment that's statistically valid that you actually get your results for these ways that we're talking about. So that's what was going on with me is I had taken the assessment and I was now given the results for the first time. So the person giving me that's the backstory. So the person giving me the debrief said, "Hey, predict what you think you would be." Well, I was an actuary in college. I was an actuarial science major and took all the actuarial exams. And Kareem, I'd happened to be a homecoming king in college at Ball State University. And I had predicted myself to be analytical and relational for the in this model. But it actually wasn't true. My number one wasn't either of those two things. It was experimental. And the second was analytical. I got a decent amount of relational, but it's in third place. And then my poor structural little puny brain there, like I can do it, but man, it takes some effort. And so when I got my results and we actually started thinking about and talking about what were my big successes in life and what were my big failures, where do I bias towards? Man, doing risky things, relatively speaking, and experimenting and always wanting to go to the next place and stand out from the crowd and all those things that you mentioned that were descriptors of experimental. That's definitely where I am. So I actually I was thinking of myself wrong based on some events that I thought were big in my life. And when I actually got my results, boy, did that just wipe the lens off a dirty window, if you will, and let me see what was really on my mind. And then I can go on to steps 2 and 3 and picking up clues like you're going to go. So anyway,
Yeah.
tell me your experience. I mean, I know
Yeah.
this is a
Well,
bit of a
I mean, I
sidebar.
actually have.
Yeah.
I think you and I have the same profile, though. I'm strongest in the experimental, second in the analytical, third in the relational, and fourth in the structural. So,
Bingo. Same with me.
my
Yeah. No
yeah,
wonder we like
my
each other.
exactly, and my preferences become sort of even more pronounced, especially towards that experimental side under pressure, right? So,
Right.
I'm notorious on my team for when something goes wrong, I'm like, throw it all out the window. Let's start over, new idea, right? So, and that kind of speaks to understanding both the strengths and the potential blind spots that your thinking brings to the table. That's important because those blind spots can often be deal killers, right? Those are the things that you might not be thinking about. Your sort of defaults might be leading you in a different direction, especially in sort of the heat of the chase, right? And you miss it and you lose the deal. And, as you look back at it in retrospect, you say, I should have known. But in the moment, unless you're being sort of proactive about thinking about your thinking, right, and mitigating some of those biases and risks, you're very susceptible to those pitfalls, to missing out on those huge opportunities.
Oh man, I love that phrase. I'm writing that down. Thinking about your thinking. So so I want to get to something really meaty, Kareem, for our audience. There is so much value in this idea of clue spotting or picking up the clues, as we both call it. Walk our audience through how they can figure out if they're talking with somebody else, could be a client, could be an internal colleague, how can they pick up some clues to figure out how that person thinks? And then we'll figure out adjustment later. But let's focus really specifically on picking up the clues now. Because this folks, if you're watching or listening, pay attention to this. This is really, really important stuff.
Yeah. Well, I mean, once you've started that process of metacognition, of thinking about your thinking, then it becomes a little bit easier. The gears start turning, right? So I'd say think about yourself, think about your blind spots, and then now that you've thought about your own thinking, think about one of your most important customers, right? Not the company, the sponsor, the stakeholder, the person that is really making that decision. And again, ask yourself, what types of thinking would you guess that they're defaulting to? Maybe they're like Bo and I, more of that big picture experimental thinker that's really bought into your vision for what the world should look like, right? Whose main concern is whether the product or service will fit into their kind of overarching goal. These tend to be the kind of buyers that are a little bit more brand promiscuous. right? Who will consider a more innovative or kind of new startup-y type of solution. But that's an important thing to know as you're going into it. Or maybe, they're a different type. Maybe they're more of that relational type, the sort of feelings buyer who's always giving you a hug or kind of looking for that personal touch, right? Their main concern is how a product makes them feel, and in some cases, look day to day, right? They're sensitive, very sensitive to the level of interaction, to the support, to the service, right? They really want to know that they're going to be well taken care of. And in terms of the buying process, they're going to take a very consensus-driven approach, right? They're going to get lots of opinions from lots of different people to make sure that everyone is on the same page. But the really good news is, even though that could extend the buying process a little bit, right? Once you got them, they are often incredibly loyal to the relationship owner, to the relationship holder, right? And so again, maybe that's the type of buyer, the type of customer, the sponsor, or stakeholder that you're working with. Or maybe they're more of that structural thinker, right? Where, they're kind of the specification buyer. They're really focused on quality, execution, ticking the boxes, right? They need to get into the details to make sure that a solution meets their particular requirements. And they'll extensively evaluate every different option, right? They'll be going through the fine print of that contract. And oftentimes, actually, price isn't even as big a concern for these types of buyers, right? They're really focused on, does this do exactly what I need it to do? And how does that process work? Really getting comfortable with exactly what it does step by step. So once you've kind of built that foundation, that trust in them, they tend to be very, very brand loyal as well. Maybe not as much on the individual relationship, but once they've established that this company, that this brand can do what they need, they'll tend to go back year after year to getting that support from that particular company. And then maybe, we've talked about 3 of the 4, but there's also the analytical thinker, right? These are probably the most difficult buyer to sell to, at least in my opinion. And this is from someone who's got a pretty strong analytical preference himself. They tend to be very focused on the value of the product and the service, and can often come across as a bit brusque or critical, right? They're going to be very price sensitive. They're going to be thinking about this purchase as an investment, looking for the greatest ROI, right? And it's worth noting that ROI can be in terms of true measurable value or sort of status or perceptions, but it has to be tangible for them. It has to be measurable. It has to be something that they can look at a month, a year, 5 years down the road and say, oh yeah, that created a 10x ROI. That was worth it, right? And so understanding, again, those are just starting to think about those different types of buyers, and understanding that, then you can start to position your product or your service around what their specific needs might be. And there's some ways of breaking this down further that, again, allow us to kind of think about our thinking, get out of that sort of bias or that default of the path of least resistance for our own brains and assuming people are on the same wavelength as us, right? And really starting to ask some questions about what they need. So I always recommend, when you're trying to read your customer's mind, the first thing to think about is just their occupation, right? As I mentioned, cognitive diversity being a huge source of value in bringing different perspectives to things. There's still some, pretty typical ways of thinking that happen in different professions. Mo, you've got experience as an actuary, admittedly the experimental actuary, which should absolutely be the name of your first memoir. But the kind of the mindsets that an actuary is buying from. What sort of mindset do you think they would have?
Well, you just nailed it. And maybe what we do for this episode is we just go some real tangible clues that we can pick up in each of the quadrants, and we'll do them in order: analytical, structure, relational, and experimental. And then what we'll do then is, in the next episode, we can talk about how to adapt in a framework of deepening relationships, which I think could be really cool. Okay, so analytical, back to actuaries. Clues there might be all very focused on their ROI, asking what the pricing is right out of the gate. Their emails might be a little more bullet pointish, a little less what'd you do on the weekend, and a little more here are the facts. They might not even sign the bottom of it, right? Being very efficient with their time. Are those clues that you see in analytical? What would you add?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, getting straight to the point, right? Bottom line. Definitely skipping out on some of the niceties to make sure that they are getting the answer that they need at that particular moment. So I would definitely say that's sort of some of the clues that you can pick up for more of that analytical mindset. if you talked about the structural sort of mindset, right? There's some overlap there. You mentioned bullet points. I'd say bullet points also very much come through in that sort of structural thinker. It's going to be, bullet or point one, point two, point three. Often, if you're reading an email, very well composed, grammatically sort of, structured type of communication. And they're going to want detail. Expect a long email, expect a long conversation, because they're going to want to know to a pretty, precise degree exactly how things are going to work. So if they're diving into the implementation plan, if they're diving into the references, right, the kind of the quality assurance sort of proof that you can provide, you might be talking to someone who's got that sort of structural mindset.
You got it. And I liked how you pointed out the bullet points, because there can be numbers in analytical and structural too.
Mm-hmm.
But the numbers and bullet points in analytical are money and logical points. And the numbers of the bullet points in structural are timelines and details and how's the not only
Sequence,
like
yeah.
sequence, like how's the implementation going to work, like you said, but even like asking for an agenda in the next meeting, like how's the next interaction going to work, down to details like that. So pop over to relational, and we'll finish up with experimental after that. But give me some clues, that some really, in person, on Zoom, in email kind of clues that you like to point out, and from the relational quadrant.
I mean, the really checking in and wanting to know how you're doing. That's a great clue, right? They're going to want to spend some time catching up at the beginning of a meeting and just kind of hearing how things are going, right? Asking about family, asking about things, outside of the realm of work is often a very big clue there for a relational thinker. Likewise, they're going to be, you're going to be seeing them really engage with you, right? They're going to be very visibly sort of active listeners. They're going to be speaking with a lot of expression in their face. They're going to be really communicating in kind of a beyond just the verbal piece, right? They're going to be doing a lot of nonverbal communication where you can really feel the warmth, the friendliness, the kind of the relationship aspects that come through there. Now, on a Zoom or over email, those can be a little more muted just because of the nature of, technology-based communication. But, we did some research on some emails, and people with a strong relational preference are going to be much more likely to start off an email with like, hope you're doing well, or, just checking in, sort of that more colloquial spoken type of language within an email, as opposed to sort of the more formal, structured type of email that you might expect for more of a memorandum type of piece of communication. So those are some of the big clues for a relational thinker.
Cool. And just, I got to tell you, I smiled with just the word memorandum. I haven't thought about a memorandum in a long time. All right, finish us up with experimental. Give us some clues there: email, Zoom, in person.
So experimental, I think off the bat, you're going to see a lot of questions, a lot of kind of bouncing around sometimes in terms of communication style, right? Sort of picking up on different threads and kind of pulling them. And for people who are not kind of naturally in that mindset, it can feel a little discombobulated, let's say, right? But it's often, trying to connect the dots is really what they're trying to do there, right? So they're thinking about the kind of broader context. Often they're going to be thinking about whether it's the market dynamics, the competitive set, the overall, sort of strategy and vision that they're really focused on trying to help achieve, and trying to connect the dots between what you're talking about and that. And so it may feel a bit disconnected, but ultimately in their mind, they're trying to provide that sort of frame of context in which to really make sense of what you're talking about, of what you're pitching to them. So that's one piece. And the other one is, they're gonna, maybe like some surprises. They're gonna throw out some ideas, right? Not necessarily to test you as much as it's kind of they're live streaming their brainstorming in the context of the discussion, right? And so you're getting a oftentimes kind of you're seeing their ideation in action, and you can really see that as kind of a clue when you feel ideas coming out of nowhere. That's a pretty good sign that you're talking to an experimental thinker.
I love it. Fantastic. This is so meaty and so valuable. So, everybody, if you want more on this and you're just dropping on this exact episode, listen to the last one where we talk about the overarching framework in much more detail, and listen to the next one where we're going to talk about how to adapt to these clues in a way that'll deepen relationships. So, Kareem, folks are going to want more of your big brain and the organization's concepts. Where should they go?
Sure. So again, go to Mo first. Lots of amazing expertise in using whole brain thinking within a business development context. The Grow Big team are geniuses when it comes to understanding how to harness cognitive diversity for better relationships and better revenue. And then if you want more about this broader notion of cognitive diversity, which can apply really beyond relationships to all manner of different aspects of business. I mean, some of my favorite case studies. Actually, Mo, some of your case studies are some of my favorites, to be honest. I love seeing the results in dollar terms. But we've got situations where cognitive diversity has created 78% more effective communication in a hospital setting. Doctors and nurses creating better outcomes for patients because they're able to communicate in a way that really speaks to that patient's mindset. Or reduction in talent attrition. We've got clients who have reduced their talent attrition by more than half, because they're actually able to train up their managers to be able to manage with empathy, to be able to think through their teams. But anyway, all of that and more is available on our website, thinkherrmann.com/Mo. Herrmann, 2 R's, 2 N's, and then Mo, M-O, and no E.
Exactly. There's no E. I love it saying that every time. All right. And if folks want more of our stuff in relation to this and our sort of weekly newsletter, instant downloads, a bunch of stuff like that, then go to growbigplaybook.com. That's growbigplaybook.com. That's just the name of our weekly newsletter that has little tips on how to just get a little bit better at business development all the time. Obviously, the Herrmann Brain Dominance instrument gets talked about a lot in those. So, Kareem, thanks for being on the show, folks. Dig into the next episode because we're going to talk about how to use these concepts to deepen relationships. Thanks, Kareem. Hey, everybody, it's Mo, and I'm back with Karim Nehdi, and we have had a ball in the last 2 episodes talking about how to use cognitive diversity to more positively impact our clients, to grow a book of business, grow our relationships, and grow our career. And specifically in the last episode, man, we went deep into how to figure out how to pick up clues with how our clients and potentially our internal colleagues are thinking, and how do we use that information to better adapt to them. In this episode, we're going to take that and we're going to go even deeper. And we're going to talk about how do you deepen relationships. So, Kareem, maybe we just go right into it, quadrant by quadrant, because people get the idea of the HBDI framework, of the Herrmann framework and the whole brain walk around. And why don't you talk about how do we adapt to each of these 4 different ways of thinking?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it starts with being intentional now. It starts about knowing where you're coming from. And again, we said this in the last episode, but the baseline is just understanding where you're likely to default, right? And what your blind spots are going to be, and being aware of those, and then taking proactive measures. I mean, we all prep for those proposal conversations, those pitch meetings. We all put care and effort into every word of that email that we're reaching, when we're selling. And really thinking about that through the lens of not your own thinking and the points that you want to make, but really the points that your audience, that your stakeholder, that your sponsor wants to hear, what they need to really understand in order to feel comfortable moving forward with this. And so, it can be about putting together that extra set of details for that more structural buyer, right? Really making sure you've thought through beyond just a big Gantt chart with a couple of bars on it, really getting into some more detail on the when of the dates for that type of a buyer, or doing some of those upfront ROI calculations for that analytical buyer who's really thinking through, okay, what is that ROI going to be? Make that job easier for them. Give them a calculator. Maybe you don't have all the inputs, but give them a way that they can actually take what you know about the value that your product or service creates and apply it to their business in a sort of very tangible, measurable way. For the relational buyer, you can stretch your thinking by really working with other clients to speak on your behalf, right? Especially someone who might be able to kind of channel that type of relational thinking if that's not really your sort of natural comfort zone. and working with others to kind of, be your sort of living testimonial, right? And for the experimental mindset and the experimental buyer, to stretch your thinking, think about, some alternatives, some crazy ideas. Challenge yourself to think about those sort of novel ideas that may be coming to the mind of that experimental buyer, by thinking about their broader context, by thinking about their their market conditions, their competitive set, what their vision and strategy is sort of prompting them to think about as they're going into this conversation with you. Think about that in advance, prepare your thinking about it, and actually try and start the conversation with that person where they're at, where their preferences are, instead of starting where you are at.
Karim, I love this. So if we had to just summarize everything, and I added a few of our words in there too. This will be a question at the end to get your feedback. But if we had to do a really concise summary of the four in the order we've been talking about, high analytical thinkers are looking for ROI or value. They want to ascertain, what am I going to pay? That's the denominator of ROI in a simple form. And they want to ascertain, how am I going to measure, and am I going to make a bet here? Am I going to do a test that I'm going to get a really, really high value in the way back? That's the numerator of ROI. So being able to understand those and highlight those, really important. That's analytical. B quadrant and that was A quadrant too. B quadrant or structural. I think what we see around that is the desire for safety. So being able to get into that Gantt chart and talk about those dates and talk about exactly how the process works, like you mentioned in the last episode, that person might be willing to pay a little bit more if you have the safest choice and they know it is foolproof. In the C quadrant or red is around connectivity, it seems. Not only the connectivity between the account team or the salesperson or the business developer or the expert and the client, but also how that connectivity of working together is going to help all their constituents, potentially all their employees, their personal team, the other stakeholders. How's that connectivity going to be dialed up in a way that we've got their back? And then the last one, the D quadrant or yellow, I loved what you said, and it made me think of two words: strategic fit. The idea of understanding their broader context, and we are perfect. We are the number one solution. We are the best solution that fits within that broader context. So their strategy is X, and we're known for doing X. Strategic fit is a big deal. It's almost like if the safety folks are buying on the details, the strategic fit or the experimental folks are buying on the headline. So give me your 2 cents on those four summaries.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I mean, one of the things that I'd pick up on is, we often think about, the relationships on a one-to-one basis, but as you know very well, Mo, today's customer relationships aren't really about that lone rainmaker, right? To the extent that they ever were, really. There are lots of people involved across the whole business development process, both internally and externally. And I think the other layer of this that we have to really consider is that you have resources on your team, right, who can help round out your particular biases and blind spots, right? And business development today is all about making your team work seamlessly together with your customer's team through every step of that process. And that's where, again, that opportunity around harnessing cognitive diversity, as someone who's leading a business development process, it's on you to make sure that you're getting the most out of your team and that you're pairing up the people that think in certain ways with the people on your client side who really need to think that way as well, or who need someone who can think with them that way. So, another way of putting it is around, business development being a team sport. And like, professional sports teams, you kind of got to think about it like Moneyball, right? In the realm of business, your team's brain power ultimately equates to, the sports team's athletic abilities. And actually, one of my favorite people who does a really good job of harnessing his team's diversity of thought is the coach of a really successful college football team. And I can't tell you who it is because he would kill me for spilling the beans on what he considers this competitive advantage. But think about this situation, right? College football, you're fielding a new team every year, right? People who may or may not have played together before. And college football is big time, high stakes stuff, right? These are 18-year-old kids on national television competing for, job opportunities in the NFL that are worth millions of dollars. So there's a lot at play here in terms of the team's dynamics. And so what this coach does is start each preseason training with an in-depth look at his team's mindset, right? He works with each individual player first to help them understand the ways that they think, but then he brings together the team, the upperclassmen who have that kind of experience and knowledge of how things work, who've kind of been there and done that a little bit more, and these new recruits who often have a lot of promise but need a little polish. And he brings those two together with a view of the diversity of thought that exists on that team to make sure that those new relationships form really quick, right? So that they can absorb that knowledge and click in to the team as quickly as possible. And, he says the process of doing this with the team at the start of each season accelerates the speed of knowledge transfer so significantly that he can get the team up and running faster, more quickly than anything else he's done. It's the sort of secret sauce of his work. And internal business development and client relationship teams are kind of like that. You need everybody to get on the same page, often really quickly and often running to take advantage of an opportunity that a deal presents.
Oh, I love that idea. And a couple things come to mind. One is obviously you and I are teaching in the last couple episodes in this one, how do you pick up those clues with your clients, with your internal colleagues and adapt? Way more powerful, obviously, to put them all through the entire assessment, because now you can do a team report, you can see everybody on one page, things like that. And it made me think, Karim, some of our best clients that have taken the HBDI to the next level. So they go through our training and they get everybody profiled. And then, of course, we weave that through every single thing someone needs to know to be great about business development. But then a few of our clients have actually had their major client teams, when they're standing up a project or working with a really long-term relationship, they put their clients through the HBDI and put their teams on a call with, or an in-person meeting or a Zoom call or whatever with them, and they all share their results to share how can we basically working on how can we all work together better in a way where the sum of our parts is much greater than individuals. And that sounds a little bit like the football example.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And we've seen that too, right? Where, I mean, you can do this in sort of the simple way where you kind of guesstimate, sort of like what we talked about in the last episode, pick up some clues, right? And that's in just 10 minutes, you can get at least a basic understanding of the different mindsets at the table and kind of identify some of the things that you need to do to bridge the gaps, some of the questions your client might be thinking about each step of the process. And ultimately, I mean, we're in the business of making customers happy. So even that little bit of understanding about what makes them tick gives you a leg up in doing that. But yeah, there's a much more sophisticated approach that, we've seen a lot in professional services as well as in technology. And you think about, you're kicking off a large scale, let's say a software implementation project for a client, right? These are 6, 7, some cases 8-figure deals. And getting it right counts for a lot, and getting it right quickly counts for a lot, right? So at that scale, an investment in taking some extra time to think about your thinking is pretty much a drop in the bucket if it makes sure that everything else goes well. It's kind of like an insurance policy almost, right? And so, yeah, as you said, what they do is they get their team together with the client stakeholder team. They do an in-depth session as a part of the overall kickoff process where they actually look at their thinking using the HBDI, and it provides that kind of precise measurement of the individuals at play, but also the team at large, right? And that helps build trust. It helps kind of grease the skids of collaboration. You get this personal view of one another. You're actually kind of like peering into one another's brain and can use that insight to communicate, solve problems more effectively. It becomes this sort of common language for the human side of the relationship, right? And it starts showing up in all these different places afterwards. It shows up in the status updates. It shows up in kind of the key milestones of the product as different team members come on and off, professional services, especially Velcro teams all the time, right? Coming in and out. You have this ability to kind of get people up and running so much more quickly, and you build that foundation of trust so much more quickly that it really creates a huge benefit for the success of the project. And it also really helps when things get stressful, because every project has its points of stress, right? And so again, if you can kind of know and predict how your client's team is going to react under stress and be able to take that into account when you got to give them that piece of bad news maybe, right? That ultimately can be really, really powerful, really valuable insights.
I love it. I love it. Well, let's do this. I had a quick reaction to that on how somebody might be able to do that at no charge, and then we'll close out this one and get ready for our next episode. I think I just loved your story about how that could work, and if somebody wanted to do that at no charge, they could have or just run with it from listener watching this episode, is they could have an in-person or a Zoom meeting. You probably want to be face to face. And they could just write up those 4 words in a 2x2 matrix, like you've shared with us in past episodes. And there's analytical thinking, and that's upper left. There's structural thinking or structured thinking, which is lower left. There's relational thinking, which is lower right, and then there's experimental thinking, which is upper right. And you could just engage in a discussion with a new team about, hey, what elements of the project, what do we need to do to be successful in each of these ways of thinking? And then from that point, start discussion of, hey, everybody pop into chat or write on a board. Where do you think you bias, things like that. And they'd get a lot of value just out of that discussion. Of course, we'd love you to call us up and hire us to help you with all this stuff. But if you wanted to run with this and you're just watching, you could have a heck of a great kickoff meeting just using that exercise, I think, and walking people through it. Karim, quick thoughts on that, and we'll close out this episode.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, there are some definite easy kind of tricks of the trade that you can use here, and actually, I think we'll talk a little bit more about them in the next episode. So to plug that one, but just in terms of thinking through the different mindsets of the buyer and building that sort of capability not only amongst yourself but amongst your team. Yeah, have that conversation. Challenge everybody who's involved in the relationship to think about their thinking and how that's going to play out in terms of the success of your shared goals.
Perfect ending. All right, Karim, people are going to want to know more how they get more of Herrmann. Where do they go?
Check out thinkherrmann.com/Mo. Herrmann spelled Herrmann, 2 R's, 2 N's, and Mo without an E. And of course, as Mo said, we'd be happy to connect you to all of the great things that Mo's team can offer you around how to leverage whole brain thinking to really build these amazing relationships. His team are geniuses at it. So give him a ring, let him know that you're a problem and he can help you solve it.
That's awesome. And people can go to bundleideagroup.com for that, 2 N's and 2 L's in bundle. Or you can sign up for our little newsletter where we cover little tips like this at growbigplaybook.com. Well, Karim, thanks. So I really appreciate you being on the episode. This is just so much value, and I can't wait to record the next one. Thanks.
Great.
Hey, everybody. I'm with Karim Nehdi, and we have had 3 awesome episodes, 3 awesome interviews right before this one. So if you like the idea of being able to leverage cognitive diversity, understand how your clients and your internal colleagues think, be able to adapt to the way they think to have better meetings, better outcomes, to grow your book of business, to grow your relationships, then go back to listen to the last episodes. But this one is going to be all about hacking your habits. Karim, how can we use cognitive diversity to hack our habits, to be more successful, even when we're really busy?
Well, I mean, just kind of bringing this back to the value of cognitive diversity. I mean, effectively being able to read the minds of the people that you work with and harness them to achieve better outcomes is a bit of a superpower, right? And so that's really what this all comes back to, is how do you find easy ways to, in some cases force yourself, often cases nudge yourself and the teams around you to be thinking about that other person and putting yourselves in their shoes and their mindset first, as opposed to going through sort of that default way of thinking that we all naturally go to that may not necessarily reflect what they need, that may have some blind spots that get in the way of actually closing a deal. And, I think the point on cognitive diversity, I just want to kind of call out, we've done a lot of research on teams in different scenarios. And as we said in the last episode, BD is a team sport, right? There's a very important role for the individual relationship, but there's also a very important role for the teams that support those relationships. And on a whole, our research shows that cognitively diverse teams who know how to harness cognitive diversity are 60 to 70% more effective than those teams that don't. And actually, that cognitive diversity accounts for about 20% of the variance in overall team performance, and up to 34% in specific activities like strategy, problem solving, and innovation, which are obviously all critical parts of the relationship building and business development processes. So, what's really interesting is that we've learned in this research over the past few years that cognitive diversity on a team positively correlates with that team's performance, but only up to kind of an optimum tipping point. And so the first hack is around really making sure that you are building your teams in sort of a diverse by design way, right? Making sure that you've got all of the representation of the different mindsets on your team. Because what we found in this research, is that there's sort of this curve that exists. We call it the cognitive diversity curve, or the cognitive diversity index, where you can sort of plot your team to see how optimally you can set up for performance in terms of your mindset. On one side of this curve, you have low cognitive diversity, which is correlated with low team performance. Effectively, that's groupthink, right? And if you all share the same blind spots, the same biases, those are going to just be magnified in a deal context, right? And then on the other side, around the line between kind of the third and fourth quartile of performance, you start to see, the third and fourth quartile of the extent of cognitive diversity, you start to see a dip in performance as cognitive diversity goes to the other extreme. Effectively, you can have too much of a good thing, right? If a team's got a lot of cognitive diversity and is not equipped with the tools to manage it, it can create this kind of emergent conflict that hinders performance. So, kind of at this tipping point between the third and fourth quartile of cognitive diversity is this optimum, this whole brain team where you get peak performance from the team, right? You have enough diversity of perspective to avoid the perils of groupthink, but not enough, not so much that you end up getting into modes of conflict all the time. And as you're pulling together a team, you need to be thinking about, as a team leader, and I know a lot of leaders listen to your show, Mo, you need to be thinking about not only where you stand, but how you're building the team around you to make sure that you're getting that optimum mix. And so you should be at least trying to recruit onto every team, as a really simple hack, at least one person who can represent the mindset of one of those four quadrants we talked about, right? Make sure that you have someone who's an experimental thinker on the team. That might be you, it might not be, but make sure you've got someone there who can connect the dots to the bigger picture. Make sure you have an analytical thinker on the team, someone who kind of defaults there, who's going to be ready with that ROI calculation right when you need it. Make sure you have the relational thinker. Again, that might be you, it might not be, who's able to really build that personal connection to ultimately drive the sorts of loyalty that result in long-term value-creating relationships. And last but certainly not least, make sure you have that structural thinker, the person who's going to make sure that on the client side, the one who's wondering, how is this actually going to get done, that they've got all the assurances they need, that it's going to be smooth sailing, that it's going to be down to the sort of the T, dotting every I, whatever you want to call it, that it's going to go foolproofly or without any issues. So
It's been a couple years, but you brought back in my mind this story I haven't thought of in forever. And we were doing a team report for a really important client team that was serving their client. And we did the team report, and it was super interesting. When you look at the four ways of thinking, they had analytical, experimental, and a decent amount of relational, just tons of people in those quadrants. And they had one person that really thought naturally, without any emphasis or anything, naturally in the structural way of thinking. And we brought that up. And what was so fascinating was that person didn't feel good about their role. They hadn't emboldened her in how important her way of thinking was, since she was sort of off on thinking island over here. Like no one else thought like her. Like there was nobody touching her in the team report, if that makes sense. When you visually depict it all on one page on paper, there was nobody near her way of thinking. And as we started to discuss it, what was super interesting is her profile was elevated, her role was elevated, her importance was elevated, because everybody realizes, oh my gosh, that is our downfall as a team. We need her to chime in even more. And effectively, the whole that session went from that person feels like an outlier to we need that person and that way of thinking more often than we've ever realized before. So thoughts on that kind of an outcome when you're talking about the research?
That's precisely it. I mean, the best teams have a shepherd, if you want to call it that, a steward for each way of thinking, right? And sometimes that can be a pretty lonely position, right? You think about let's use our favorite example from these episodes, a team of actuaries, right? That experimental actuary might be a lone wolf in that team, right? But they can bring an incredible amount of perspective to that buyer who needs that big picture perspective in order to actually sign the deal, right? And so that's, again, designing your team intentionally with a view towards cognitive diversity, with a view towards thinking, and a view towards your customer's mindset is a hugely important hack. The other hack that I'd call out, and this is a really simple one, even more simple than designing your team. This is what we call the 4 questions, or just called doing a whole brain walk around. And this is something that, I actually picked up from a number of CEOs that I've worked with over the years. And actually, I'll tell you a quick story now about how I got involved in Herrmann. And as you know, Mo, and for our listeners out there, Herrmann is a family business I'm the third generation of family leadership in the business. And I think like a lot of people who grow up in the context of a family business, for a good chunk of my career, I wanted to do anything but work in the family business, right? But I kept getting reminded by the power of this work, of this notion of cognitive diversity and thinking about your thinking in so many ways. And one of the most powerful ones was with the C-suite and the CEO of a large consumer goods company. And this was back in the day when we were all doing our Vision 2020 plans, right? If only we knew what was actually going to happen in 2020. But we were presenting a pretty radical vision for what the company could be, really shifting it to be much more of a health and wellness type of a play from your sort of standard old guard consumer packaged goods type of company, food and beverage, and we were working closely with the chief marketing officer, months of work, putting together a brilliant deck, getting all the right people involved. And literally the 11th hour, night before the presentation to the board, he says, the flow of this deck just isn't working for me. I need you to rewrite it around the Herrmann model. Have you ever heard of the Herrmann model? And he had no idea about my family connection to all of this, right? He was totally in the dark about this. And I was, I wasn't out there wearing it on my sleeve. And so I said, yeah, I've heard of it. Of course, I had my first order of business was preventing a mutiny on my team for having to redo months of work based on this crazy notion that my grandfather had. This company, it was kind of a common language, especially the C-suite. And I think what was most important was that the CEO always went into every meeting asking 4 questions. Every meeting, you had to have 4 questions answered. Why, what, who, how. And of course, those 4 things tie to those 4 different ways of thinking, right? Those 4 topics, the 4 questions. Why is this important? What's the context? How does this fit into the bigger picture? What is it, is it in terms of the vision and strategy, competition, changing market dynamics, trends, whatever it is? Why is it important that we're talking about this right now? CEOs got very limited time, right? A board's got very limited time. Why is this the most important thing for us to be talking about? Then what? What specifically do we need to know about the situation, the problem? What are the most relevant facts, the most relevant numbers, the most relevant technical specifics we need in order to make a rational decision? And then who needs to be involved? How do we make sure that we've gotten the right viewpoints, the right insights from the right people? In this case, it was a pretty complicated landscape because you have consumers, you have retailers that they sell to, you have your own internal talent. They had a pretty complicated structure. All of those different components needed to be taken into account, and we need to really think through how do you best communicate and engage with them to make sure that they're on board. And then again, last but not least, the how. How are we going to actually make this work? What's the brass tacks? What's the plan? Key action items, next steps. How's it actually going to happen? When's it actually going to happen? How are we going to manage the risks of execution? So making sure that in every meeting, you're answering those 4 questions is a critical hack, right? To making sure that you are addressing the needs of all of the diversity of thinkers that may be involved, right? That you don't get sidetracked or kind of rooted in your own thinking and your own default biases and get sort of suckered into a blind spot, right, of not being able to meet your customers' needs in that particular moment. So, I know, again, CEOs who make this their core agenda for every meeting. I know people who make this their email structure, right? They have their template for their email has their signature and these 4 questions. It's just sort of an easy hack to make sure that you're covering all of your thinking bases and ensuring that you give every type of thinker something they can connect with, something that motivates them.
Karim, absolutely love it. I've seen the power of the whole brain walk around of the 4 questions, and literally, I think thousands. Well, it has to be tens of thousands of ways of doing it, because it comes up in every meeting we do, it comes up in training we do, it comes up in our coaching conversations. And just for our audience, the why ties to experimental, the what ties to analytical, the who ties to relational, and the how ties to structural. So if you've been watching all the episodes so far, if you haven't, go back and watch or listen. But if you haven't, that's where the 4 questions line up. And I'll just close with one little hack, and then we'll finish things up. Karim, is a really great way to take notes in a meeting is to just take out a blank piece of paper, draw a big plus sign on that piece of paper, and write in the upper right experimental, in the upper left analytical, in the lower left structural, and then in the bottom right relational. You can always put those questions in there: hi, what, how, who, too. and just take notes in that way, and you'll basically have a progress bar for how the meeting is going. Because if you end up with a lot of notes in one or two of the quadrants and nothing in others, boom, that's a trigger halfway through the meeting. Say, hey, we haven't talked about X, or we haven't answered the question what, or whatever. And it's just super, super powerful, super easy to do. So, Karim, everybody's going to want more of your big brain, your entire organization's big brain. Where should they go?
Well, check out thinkherman.com/Mo. Herman spelled Herrmann, and Mo spelled without the E. Or just give Mo a call. Mo's got far more genius than I ever wished I could have. So, if you need someone who can really help you think through your specific business development challenges to really build your team's capability, not just around cognitive diversity, but how to apply that to really achieve amazing outcomes for business development, he's your guy.
That's perfect. And if folks did reach out to us and they had a question we couldn't answer, we'd kick back to you. So we're a good sort of filter for that. So folks, if you do want to learn more about what we do, that's at bundleideagroup.com. Bundles, 2 N's and 2 L's, bundleideagroup.com. You've got Think Herman with 2 R's and 2 N's.com/Mo is a great place to go, just spelled M-O. And you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter, which pulls in lots of insights like this over at growbigplaybook.com. Karim, man, thanks so much. This has been a blast. I knew it would be fun. And, your comment about me about all the stuff we know, I'm never going to know half of what you know until I wear the purple velour sport coat. So that's a great way to end it. That's my next tip. I think I need to go get one. I have blue velour, but I don't have purple velour. Now I know your secrets. Hey, thanks for being on the show. It's been awesome. You always add value. I always enjoy it. And this surpassed even my really high expectations. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mo. It's been a blast.
Hey, it's Mo Bundle, your host here at Real Relationships, Real Revenue. And it was awesome to interview Karim Nehdi, CEO of Herrmann International, over the last 4 episodes. If you're dropping into this one out of the gate, there's a ton of content in this one in the sense that I'm going to describe everything so you could listen to just this episode and get all the value. But if you want to go deeper, if you get value out of this one, go back and listen to Karim directly. In the last 4 episodes, we go into much more detail than I'm going to go into today. So think of today as the Cliff's Notes, the quick version of how we can become more effective communicators, more effective client relationship developers by using cognitive diversity. So I and my teams have trained over 15,000 experts all over the world. In our Grow Big training, our book called The Snowball System goes into this too, but it's this comprehensive system for how you can do business development efficiently, effectively, and with authenticity, always having your client's best interests in mind. And using the IP, using the frameworks that are owned by Herrmann International, Karim obviously being the CEO, using those frameworks is something that threads through every single thing that we teach. We absolutely love it. So I encourage you to, if you want to go super deep, grab the book, The Snowball System, come through one of our trainings. But I'm going to give you today the quick version of how you can be super effective using cognitive diversity, flexing your thinking to meet the needs of others. Before we get into it too much, know that if you want a weekly little tip, a nugget, an insight dropped into your inbox, you can read in 3 or 4 minutes or less. Head over to growbigplaybook.com. Sign up there at growbigplaybook.com. You can sign up in 20 seconds. I personally spend a couple hours every week writing a little article, distilling it down to something you can read in a few minutes, something you can put into practice right away. So if you go to sign up at growbigplaybook.com, you'll get those, and they just drop in your inbox every single week. So head over to growbigplaybook.com to get that. All right, here's my summary of, and with a little new insights into the 3 big things that you want to learn, that you want to know, that you want to put into place from my interview with Karim. And I'm actually drawn on our experience from training at this point, almost 20,000 people all over the world. So 3 things are, how do you pick up the clues of how others are thinking? 1. 2 is what's most important to them that you need to prioritize in your communication. And 3, how do you adapt to each of those? So first, the framework. Again, if you want more detail, go back and listen to some of the prior episodes that are recorded with Karim, the 4 before this one. But there's 4 major ways we think. We think analytically, we think structurally, procedurally, if you will. We think relationship-wise or relationally. We think experimentally, big ideas, concepts. And I'm going to walk through the clues that you get from each of those four right away. Clues in from an analytical thinker. Things are going to be quick. They're going to be thinking or writing in bullet points. They're going to want to cut to the chase. Not a lot of fluff, not a lot of pleasantries, things like that. They want to jump right into the meeting and get some things done. They want to be technically accurate. So those are clues that you've got a high analytical thinker. Now let's think structural. Clues that you've got a high structure thinker. These are things like wanting to know all the details, wanting to get an agenda before a meeting, wanting to know what the process looks like, wanting to know what different steps we need to do to start something and to keep it going. Now let's move to the relational thinker. Here you're more in the right brain. You're in the right side of the brain. Not right isn't correct, but literally the right side of the brain as opposed to left. And so over in the right hemisphere, things are a little more instinctive, or maybe a better word would be a little more intuitive. So in the relational thinker, we're going to see clues that are more truly caring. A little more emotion in the voice, a little higher highs, a little lower lows. You could hear little questions or comments around the empathy, thinking from the perspective of others often, flipping to see how someone else, constituent or a stakeholder or someone else involved, would enjoy something or not enjoy it. Really asking questions and acting to try to dial up the engagement or the happiness of others. And lastly, we've got the experimental thinker. This is my high thinking style. You heard this from Karim too, his as well. Part of the reason we get along so well. And the idea with experimental, are the clues that you're going to get are things like a little zigzag, a little starting here and going there, a little less structure, if you will. A little look, there's a squirrel. Wanting to do things that haven't been done before, wanting to experiment, wanting to run tests. Also wanting things to align, connecting those dots, as Karim taught us, things like that. So if those are our clues in each of the four, here's what you want to think about value. This is the most important part of this particular episode. Analytical is really going to want to dial up ROI. They're going to want to dial up the value. They're going to want to dial down the costs. So talking about things mathematically, how you can prove things out, how you can measure things. They're trying to dial up that ROI. So talking about making it clear that you have an economically viable or superior solution. Perfect. Second thing, structural. The thing that's a priority here is, and this is really interesting, a lot of people don't get this right out of the gate, it's safety. So the desire to pick the safe solution. That's why all those Gantt charts and timelines and processes and details are so important to this type of thinker, to the structural thinker, because they might be willing to spend a little bit more, for example, but that's only if you're the safest choice. So that's what you want to prioritize. Third, relational. The idea here is dialing up connectivity or engagement. So communicating what you do in a way of how it positively impacts lots of people, how you've got their teams back, how they can reach out to you at any time, maybe late at night, offering your cell phone number, spending the time to get to know the team, our whole team and their whole team. Those kind of things are hugely important. Dialing up the win for everybody, the engagement for everybody. There's your priority there. In the last quadrant, experimental. The idea here is strategic fit. The priority is being able to use their priorities that they shared in their words and tuck in whatever you do and show that it's an 100% alignment. It has 100% strategic fit with where they're heading. So if structural folks are sort of prioritizing the details or safety, experimental folks are prioritizing the headline, the fit, the simple fit. They need X, you specialize in X, and then be able to dial up a little, maybe some innovative bells and whistles in addition. That's what you want to prioritize. So your big priorities, ROI and or safety and or relations and kind of connectivity and or a strategic fit. So our last piece, how do we adapt to those things? Well, we sort of hinted to it in my descriptions, but to put a fine point on it, what you might really dial up in adaptation when you're talking about things to an analytical thinker is really making it easy to talk about money and measurement. In structural, making it easy to talk about the details, the onboarding process, the ongoing process, and how every single piece of that has been tweaked and evolved over years or decades to show that you really know what you're doing and it's a safe choice to choose you. That third area, relational, getting to know the other person, getting our team to know their team, connecting not just on a project or a product kind of level or service level, but as human beings, getting to know them and what they're trying to achieve and really dialing up that connectivity and that engagement overall. And doing that for other constituents as well that may be outside of the decision-making process. And then lastly, that experimental quadrant, what you want to do to adapt there is make it super simple what you stand for and how that aligns to the other folks, and to the goals of the organization that the other folks have. And the idea there is what we teach in our classes is positioning. There's a bunch of research that shows that people believe value propositions or believe positioning statements in the rule of three, that having three elements is the most believable. And then there's further research that says on average we can remember between 3 and 4 concepts at a time. So there's a magic in three between believability and also in memorability. So being able to say we really focus on A, B, and C in our work, and if A, B, and C line up with where they're taking the organization or this particular type of work, the context that they've given you, if you can use their words, their priorities as you discuss A, B, and C, then you have got a winner. So I'll finish out this episode with this one. We covered those things in the prior episodes in a lot more nuance and a lot more detail in just a funny back and forth way, but hopefully memorable and valuable too. But what I thought I'd do in this episode is just in a really concise way, cover those big three. How do I pick up the clues of who I'm talking to? What are they prioritizing in their decision-making process? And how do I adapt to those priorities? The last thing I'll leave you with this is big deals are sold by teams to teams. So when you really crush your communication, when you really kill it in a finalist meeting or a high stakes conversation, it's when you hit all 4 things. The research shows in several million people that have been surveyed and that have taken the full HBDI, they've got their actual results, is that the vast majority of people are 1, 2, or 3 thinking styles. So while I describe it as if somebody's only analytical or only relational, you'll sort of have to describe the framework, describe the model. But the vast majority of people have more than one strong preference. So as soon as you get a few people together, you're probably assured that all 4 thinking styles are represented. And that's why you want to make sure you hit a little bit of all 4. So while we describe them as unique things, almost like each person's one of those, the vast majority of people are more than one. And as soon as you have a few people making a decision, you can probably be assured every one of those ways of thinking is represented. So you want to hit all 4 as you have your conversation. So I hope that is a lot of information really quickly. I hope it's helpful. And keep listening and watching because there's more good value coming your way in future episodes. Talk to you soon, and thanks for being an amazing audience.